This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
That is, man lived before he came to this earth. He is an eternal being. Joseph Smith gave to the world the true understanding of the origin of man, that man comes to earth with a divine and eternal purpose.
Let's examine the doctrine.
And through it, all who believe and obey the glorious gospel of God, all who are true and faithful and overcome the world, all who suffer for Christ and his word,
all of it,
all shall become as their Maker and sit with him on his throne and reign with him forever in everlasting glory.
And see what it has to offer.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished and love of God and neighbor rules the world. In the name of Jesus Christ.
What can be gleaned from Mormon teachings?
A corollary to the pernicious falsehood that God is dead is the equally pernicious doctrine that there is no devil. Satan himself is the father of both of these lies. To believe them is to surrender to him.
And where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you to become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Hello. Welcome to the Naked Mormonism podcast. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On today's episode, we're going to finish talking about Martin Harris, or, as we know him, Not-So-Smarty-Marty, until we talk about the 11 witnesses of the plates. Alright, our narrative left off with Martin Harris giving $50 to Joe to pay his court fees and other debts, and move to his in-laws' house in Pennsylvania. Now let's talk about how Joe really translated the gold plates. This recently publicized controversy has been a source of interest to South Park watchers and true-believing Mormons alike. While many paintings and pictures used in LDS churches and books depict a prayerful Joe leaning over the plates, it is truly incontrovertible that Joe used a hat and a seer stone to translate the plates. In his comprehensive History of the Church, LDS historian Brigham H. Roberts quotes Not-So-Smarty-Marty. He said that Smith possessed a seer stone, described by Roberts as a chocolate-colored, somewhat egg-shaped stone, which the prophet found while digging a well in company with his brother Hiram. This is a quote from Marty himself. I will now give you a description of the manner in which the Book of Mormon was translated. Joseph would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light, and in the darkness the spiritual light would shine. That was in an address to all believers in Christ, page 12. Not-So-Smarty-Marty was smart enough to keep an eye on his investment, and ended up scribing for Joe for the 116 pages that we talked about. After Joe would put his head in the hat like an emu shoves their head into the ground, this would happen. Quote, by aid of the seer stone, sentences would appear and were read by the prophet and written by me, Martin, and when I finished would say, written, and if correctly written, the sentence would disappear and another appear in its place. But if not written correctly, it remained until corrected, so that the translation was just as it was engraven on the plates, precisely in the language then used. Not-So-Smarty-Marty's description concurs with that of David Whitmer. He's another big hitter whose testimony appears at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, along with Oliver Cowdery and Not-So-Smarty-Marty as the three witnesses. We'll talk about David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery and give them proper names in upcoming episodes, but for now, just understand they both play big parts in the foundation of the church, and we'll be referring to them pretty frequently for a while. Anyway, David Whitmer was quoted on page 12 of his book, An Address to All Believers in Christ. I will now give you a description of the manner in which the Book of Mormon was translated. Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat, and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light. And in the darkness the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was his principal scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph, to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear. Thus the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God, and not by any power of man. Not by any power of man. That's an interesting thing to say. I'm kind of tempted to unpack it and speculate, saying that the plates didn't even need to be present in the room if everything was translated from a fucking rock in a hat. But why is this something that the church doesn't readily talk about? There's no mention of a hat anywhere on the LDS.org website, but the very people who translated it don't talk about him reading from plates with a chest plate that was equipped with 2,500-year-old glasses fastened to them. They only talk about a convicted con man staring into a smelly old hat with a fucking brown rock in it. Joe dictated these 116 pages to Not-So-Smarty-Marty, which was called the Book of Lehi. For anybody unfamiliar with the Book of Mormon, Lehi is the name of the narrator's father for most of the beginning of the book. Once these 116 pages were complete, Marty, being the street dumb business wise guy he was, wanted to get an outside opinion on how the book was going. I assume he wanted to either vindicate Joe as holy sounding enough to be an actual called prophet of God, or have somebody say this is utter bullshit and you should cut your losses and run from that asshole Joe. Well, Lucy, Not-So-Smarty-Marty's cousin wife, did exactly that. We heard her statement in episode 3. Remember that? She said Marty beat her so hard that she had marks for 2 weeks after. We don't actually have record of this to prove the correlation, but I want to speculate that she read the 116 pages and considered them complete bollocks, at which point she decided to hide them from Marty on her own volition. Marty beat the living hell out of her because she wouldn't tell him where she hid the pages, because if Joe was a holy man with divine source material, he could just translate the same thing over again, right? She ended up never giving up the manuscript and sent Marty back to Joe in Pennsylvania with empty hands. I hope you guys can harken back to episode 1. I read a preface from the 1830 manuscript of the Book of Mormon. It was written by the hand of Joe. I'm just going to read it again. It's not too arduous, and it's kind of entertaining. So, quote, as many false reports have been circulated respecting the following work, and also many unlawful measures taken by the evil designing persons to destroy me, and also the work, I would inform you that I translated by the gift and power of God, and caused to be written 116 pages, the which I took from the Book of Lehi, which was an account abridged from the plates of Lehi by the hand of Mormon, which said account some person or persons have stolen and kept from me, notwithstanding my utmost exertions to recover it again, and being commanded of the Lord that I should not translate the same over again, for Satan had put it into their hearts to tempt the Lord their God, by altering the words that they did read contrary from that which I translated and caused to be written. And if I should bring forth the same words again, or, in other words, if I should translate the same over again, they would publish that which they had stolen. And Satan would stir up the hearts of this generation, that they might not receive this work. But behold, the Lord said unto me, I will not suffer that Satan shall accomplish his evil design in this thing. Therefore thou shalt translate from the plates of Nephi, until ye come to that which ye have translated, which ye have retained. And behold, ye shall publish it as the record of Nephi. And thus I will confound those who have altered my words. I will not suffer that they shall destroy my work, yea, I will shew unto them that my wisdom is greater than the cunning of the devil, Wherefore, to be obedient unto the commandments of God, I have, through his grace and mercy, accomplished that which he hath commanded me respecting this thing. I would also inform you that the plates of which hath been spoken were found in the township of Manchester, Ontario County, New York. Upon learning that the 116 pages were stolen, Joe had his first recorded divine revelation, and this makes up Doctrine and Covenants section 3. Verse 13 through 15. I'm just going to read them. Who has set at naught the counsels of God, and has broken the most sacred promises which were made before God, and had depended upon his own judgment, and boasted in his own wisdom. And this is the reason that thou hast lost thy privileges for a season, for thou hast suffered the counsel of thy director to be trampled upon from the beginning. Yes, Joe went home pouting because that bitch Lucy Harris stole all his hard work for the past 4 months, and he came back with divine revelation, saying that he can't translate for a little while because God's acting pissy because Marty fucked up. I'm sorry, it's just so sad. It really is. It's pathetic. A little side note, slightly further down in that same section 3, Joe talks about not only the Lamanites, but about the Josephites, the Lemuelites, the Ishmaelites, the Jacobites, and even mentions the Lamanites coming to the knowledge of Jesus Christ. How the fuck did he know all of this when all that he had translated was the very first part of the plates from the perspective of one person? All of those are groups of people, and the Lamanites coming to the knowledge of Jesus Christ, those are all later in the Book of Mormon, and he hadn't translated any of that yet. He had only translated the Book of Lehi so far. It's so demonstrably clear that he had an outline of what was going to be translated before he dictated it. And when I say the word translated there, I mean that pretty loosely. Let's just say authored there instead. He had been imagining this shit into existence since 1823, when Moroni first popped into his room for a midnight visit. He was just pissed off that he had done so much work, all for nothing, and now he's stuck in between a rock and a hard place. Should he, A, try and recreate the beginning from the Lehi's perspective and possibly fight a legal and reputation battle upon the release of his manuscript because of the discrepancies in the other copy, or B, just rewrite it completely from Nephi's perspective as opposed to Lehi, Nephi's dad, and instantly justify the discrepancies as perspective differences, dodging the proverbial PR bullet? Well, obviously Joe chose correctly because he won out, and the lost 116-page manuscript remains lost forever with no known trace anywhere. Joe started translating again in 1829 with the help of David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery, still with funding from Not-So-Smarty-Marty. I mentioned David and Oliver earlier, but they are way too much to get into now, so let's just finish up the translation of the Book of Mormon. Please bear with me on the boredom. We are almost done with the entire authorship of the Book of Mormon, and there are just a few more points to get to. If anybody is interested, Doctrine and Covenants section 10 contains a revelation telling Joe to translate from a different section of the plates, meaning the Book of Nephi. That was apparently needed to be divine revelation as well. With his dream team of translators and his reinstated power of translation, the first Book of Mormon manuscript was produced in August 1829. Then Not-So-Smarty-Marty made the not-so-smartiest move one could possibly imagine. He mortgaged his house and 240 acres to finance the printing of the Book of Mormon. It's amazing to imagine that Kinkos or even high efficiency in-home printers didn't really exist at that time. We're talking about an early 19th century printing press with individual letter tiles. This method of mass printing is only marginally better than houses full of monks that each copy only one book at a time for years on end. So this was such a costly and tenacious process. So Marty obviously had a lot of financial stake rooted in the success of the Book of Mormon and consequently the Mormon religion itself. But we'll get into that quite a bit later. So let's hear what Dallin H. Oaks has to say about these financial contributions. Quote, "One of Martin Harris's great contributions to the church, for which he should be honored for all time, was his financing the publication of the Book of Mormon. In August 1829, he mortgaged his home and farm to Egbert B. Grandin to secure payment on the printer's contract. 7 months later, the 5,000 copies of the first printing of the Book of Mormon were completed. Later, when the mortgage note fell due, the home and a portion of the farm were sold for $3,000. In this way, Martin Harris was obedient to the Lord's revelation. Thou shalt not covet thine own property, but impart it freely to the printing of the Book of Mormon. Pay the debt thou hast contracted with the printer. Release thyself from bondage. End quote. That last part that I went into Queen's English for, that was actually divine revelation, supposedly from Joseph. You can find that in Doctrine and Covenants, section 19, verse 26 and 35. Yeah, Joe was kind of an asshole. He needed to have divine revelation to make Marty pay up on his bill. So honestly, I really feel pretty bad for Not-So-Smarty-Marty. He was just a superstitious businessman that got suckered into selling his farm so a failed holy book could be published. If someone would have told Marty at that time that in 2012 the Mormon Church would own a $5 billion shopping mall in the heart of Salt Lake City, he wouldn't have known whether to shit or go blind, because that $3,000 that he mortgaged off for print would be the equivalent of about $125,000 now. And that was pretty much everything he had. We will eventually talk about this Mormon shopping mall that I mentioned earlier. It's called the City Creek Center, but it's probably going to have to be a bonus episode or something, because we're not going to be done with church history for quite some time. So, back to pitying Not-So-Smarty-Marty. Joe did such a good job pulling the wool over Marty's eyes, and Marty thought he was in control the whole time. That's what's so sad about it. If anything, this hopefully demonstrates how diabolical and manipulative Joe was. Don't worry, Joe wasn't this way to only Marty. You will see it become a recurring theme throughout the foundation of the church. In soon-to-come episodes, we will cover the 11 witnesses' testimonies in great length, and you'll hopefully begin to understand how persuasive and charismatic Joe was. It's quite impressive. So let's take this bit for example. This was from Dean C. Jesse in Joseph Knight's Recollection of Early Mormon History in BYU Studies, autumn 1976. Quote, after returning from a trip to Palmyra to settle his affairs, Martin began to transcribe from April 12th to June 14th. Joseph translated while Martin wrote, with only a curtain between them. Now when it says a curtain, it was actually an entire corner of a room that was walled off with the curtain, so it wasn't just like they were like sitting on opposite sides of a table and there was just a sheet up. It was like Joseph had like this office that was sanctioned off in a room for it. Going back to it, quote, on occasion they took breaks from the arduous task, sometimes going to the river and throwing stones. Once Martin found a rock closely resembling the seer stone Joseph sometimes used in place of the interpreters, and substituted it without the prophet's knowledge. How dare he! When the translation resumed, Joseph paused for a long time, and then exclaimed, Martin, what is the matter? All is as dark as Egypt. Martin then confessed that he wished to stop the mouths of fools who told him that the prophet memorized sentences and merely repeated them. Well, could have fooled me, I suppose. Joe was obviously playing Marty like a fiddle. I mean, come on, this is abundantly clear. Marty truly must have believed everything that came out of Joe's mouth, because as we'll later find out, he gets his overly credulous ass financially, spiritually, maritally, and morally kicked by everything Joe put him through. Something we read later illustrates how much of a sucker he was for what came out of Joe's mouth. But that's going to come up when we're talking about some scholars, which is what we're getting into now. The name of these three scholars are Luther Bradish, Charles Anthon, and Samuel L. Mitchell. Charles Anthon is the only one of the three that we need to talk about here, because he's the only one that actually left anything behind for us to look at. So we'll actually just give him a name and call him Not-So-Smarty-Marty's super study smarty party pooper pal Charlie. That's much more fitting than just Charles Anthon. Yeah. Smarty Charlie is a little easier. So, Not-So-Smarty-Marty, being the business genius he was, decided that it might be a good idea to verify that Joe was indeed translating a recognizable ancient language. It would seem that if the ancient text could be verified, it would lend a lot of credence to the work that Joe and Marty were engaged in, right? Think about the publicity. Headlines reading, ancient gold plates found in New York home backyard has inscriptions validated by Columbia College professor to be genuine. People would lose their minds. People would literally travel thousands of miles for a chance to study it in comparison with other ancient texts of the same time and period, right? That's just how scholarly work goes. And if it were truly found to be another testament of Jesus Christ, upon translation by multiple bodies of scholars, of course, this would truly change the entire religious world. Right? I mean, come on, this is absolutely amazing. But what if the symbols on the source text can't be verified? Like, literally can't be verified for various reasons. We should find out first what those reasons are for the inaccessibility to the original, and second, find out why the symbols that are revealed don't comport with any ancient languages that we are aware of. Well, Not-So-Smarty-Marty was smart enough to use a call-a-friend lifeline and found just such a professor at said Columbia College to do said ancient language verification task. Let's dig into Smarty Charlie. Smarty Charlie was the son of a Revolutionary War medical veteran who later became a Surgeon General. He grew up in New York and eventually graduated Columbia with honors in 1815. He became assistant professor of Greek and Latin at Columbia in 1820 and later on became a full professor and director of the entire languages department at the college, a post he held until 1864. Marty must have assumed that this dude was the right dude for the job. I mean, honestly, you can't really blame him. I mean, every early Testament manuscript of Jesus Christ that has ever been found has been in Greek, as opposed to Aramaic, which Jesus theoretically spoke. But no ancient manuscript has ever been found in ancient Hebrew that is a testament of Jesus Christ, of Jesus the Nazareth. And no Egyptian text has ever been found that has anything to do with Jesus of Nazareth. So, a professor of Greek and Latin would seem like a logical person to seek the expertise of when talking about ancient holy texts that profess knowledge of Jesus Christ. That makes sense. Marty made a good decision. Well, unfortunately, Joe was the only person on the planet that ever reportedly saw the engravings that were on the plates. There wasn't room for two people's heads in one divinely inspired hat, so Marty had to compromise, which meant he was forced to ask Joe to copy down an inscription from the plates onto a piece of paper. Joe was pretty reluctant to give it up at first, but any smart businessman knows that 50 no's and a yes means yes, and Joe finally gave up the goods. So Not-So-Smarty-Marty went to Not-So-Smarty-Marty Super Study Smarty Party Pooper pal Charlie Anthon at Columbia to hopefully be told the good news that Joe was translating genuine ancient characters. Let's hear what Marty had to say about the situation in a letter he wrote. Quote, I went to the city of New York and presented the characters which had been translated, with the translation thereof, to Professor Charles Anthon, a gentleman celebrated for his literary attainments. Professor Anthon stated that the translation was correct, more so than any he had before seen translated from the Egyptian. I then showed him those which were not yet translated, and he said that they were Egyptian, Chaldaic, Assyriac, and Arabic, and he said they were true characters. He gave me a certificate certifying to the people of Palmyra that they were true characters, and that the translation of such of them as had been translated was also correct. I took the certificate and put it into my pocket, and was just leaving the house, when Mr. Anthon called me back and asked me how the young man found out there were gold plates in the place where he found them. I answered that an angel of God had revealed it unto him. Oh, that's a mistake. Do that to a college professor, he's going to call bullshit on you. Sorry, it goes on. He then said to me, let me see that certificate. I accordingly took it out of my pocket and gave it to him. When he took it and tore it to pieces, saying that there was no such thing now as ministering of angels, and that if I would bring the plates to him, he would translate them. I informed him that part of the plates were sealed, and that I was forbidden to bring them. He replied, I cannot read a sealed book. I left him and went to Dr. Mitchell, who sanctioned what Professor Anthon had said respecting both the characters and the translation. Now, I really want to dive into the claims that Marty makes here, but first we have to get Charlie's side of the meeting. Unfortunately, one of the only things we have recorded by Charlie is this letter almost exactly 60 years after the occurrence, just as the stories of the Mormons were starting to run rampant throughout New York, so the accuracy of his statement may need to be taken with a grain of salt. It is written by Charles Anthon to E.D. Howe, who was reporting on the Mormons at the time. The letter is kind of long, but it provides a lot of good information, and I do plan on adding some commentary to it, primarily just conclusions I've drawn from all the evidence I can find about the situation. This is in New York, February 17th, 1834. Dear Sir, I received this morning your favor of the 9th instant, and lose no time in making a reply. The whole story about my having pronounced the Mormonite inscription to be Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphs is perfectly false. Some years ago, a plain and apparently simple-hearted farmer called upon me with a note from Dr. Mitchell of our city, now deceased, requesting me to decipher, if possible, a paper which the farmer would hand me, and which Dr. M. confessed he had been unable to understand. Upon examining the paper in question, I soon came to the conclusion that it was all a trick, perhaps a hoax. When I asked the person who brought it how he obtained the writing, he gave me, as far as I can now recollect, a following account: a gold book consisting of a number of plates of gold fastened together in the shape of a book by wires of the same metal, had been dug up in the northern part of the state of New York, and along with the book an enormous pair of gold spectacles. These spectacles were so large that if a person attempted to look through them, his two eyes would have to be turned towards one of the glasses merely, the spectacles in question being altogether too large for the breadth of the human face. Whoever examined the plates through the spectacles was enabled not only to read them, but fully to understand their meaning. All this knowledge, however, was confined at that time to a young man who had the trunk containing the book and spectacles in his sole possession. So everything that Charlie has said in the letter up to this point has been, completely verified. This is all accurate. So everything that we see now, we can say he's not lying about. That's true. So he goes on. This young man was placed behind a curtain in the garret of a farmhouse, and being thus concealed from view, put on the spectacles occasionally, or rather, looked through one of the glasses, deciphered the characters in the book, and, having committed some of them to paper, handed copies from behind the curtain to those who stood on the outside. It's interesting, there's no mention of a hat in there, so even at this time, Marty was concealing the fact that Joseph was using a white hat and a rock in the white hat to translate the plates. So, it's kind of interesting to see the origins of lying for the Lord, but we'll continue on with Charlie here. Quote, not a word, however, was said about the plates having been deciphered by the gift of God. Everything in this way was affected by the large pair of spectacles. The farmer added that he had been requested to contribute a sum of money towards the publication of the gold book, the contents of which would, as he had been assured, produce an entire change in the world and save it from ruin. So urgent had been these solicitations that he intended selling his farm and handing over the amount received to those who wished to publish the plates. What we're talking about here, Joseph had not even finished translating the 116 pages, and he was already hitting up Martin Harris to publish this book to sell his farm. And it's just so, you just see the seeds of con being placed so delicately in the heart of Martin Harris. It's made just so abundantly clear. Let's continue. As a last precautionary step, however, he had resolved to come to New York and obtain the opinion of the learned about the meaning of the paper which he brought with him. Not a bad idea, and which had been given him as a part of the contents of the book, although no translation had been furnished at the time by the young man with the spectacles. On hearing this odd story, I changed my opinion about the paper, and, instead of viewing it any longer as a hoax upon the learned, I began to regard it as a part of a scheme to cheat the farmer out of his money, and I communicated my suspicions to him, warning him to beware of rogues. So Charlie saw this right through. He saw straight through Martin into Joe and figured out that he was a con man, and told Martin at this time, you're gonna get swindled. You gotta watch out. He continues, he requested an opinion from me in writing, which of course I declined giving, and he then took his leave, carrying the paper with him. The paper was in fact a singular scrawl. It consisted of all kinds of crooked characters disposed in columns, and had evidently been prepared by some person who had before him at the time a book containing various alphabets, Greek and Hebrew letters, crosses and flourishes, Roman letters inverted or placed sideways were arranged in perpendicular columns, and the whole ended in a rude delineation of a circle divided into various compartments, decked with various strange marks, and evidently copied after the Mexican calendar given by Humboldt, but copied in such a way as not to betray the source from whence it was derived. I am thus particular as to the contents of the paper, inasmuch as I have frequently conversed with my friends on the subject since the Mormonite excitement began, and well remember that the paper contained anything else but Egyptian hieroglyphs. He says it right there. They contained anything but Egyptian hieroglyphs. He didn't know what they were, but there was all kinds of crazy numbers and shapes and all kinds of stuff, but there was no hieroglyphs on there. He continues, sometime after, the same farmer paid me a second visit. Now, this is interesting. This is something worth paying attention to. He brought with him the golden book in print and offered it to me for sale. I declined purchasing. He then asked permission to leave the book with me for examination. I declined receiving it, although his manner was strangely urgent. I had adverted once more to the roguery which had been, in my opinion, practiced upon him, and asked him what had become of the gold plates. He informed me that they were in a trunk with the large pair of spectacles. I advised him to go to a magistrate and have the trunk examined. He said the curse of God would come upon him should he do this. That's what I was referring to earlier when I said we would learn about Marty's credulity. He said the curse of God would come upon him should he do this. On pressing him, however, to pursue the course which I had recommended, he told me that he would open the trunk if I would take the curse of God upon myself. I replied that I would do so with the greatest willingness and would incur every risk of that nature, provided I could only extricate him from the grasp of rogues. He then left me. I have thus given you a full statement of all that I know respecting the origin of Mormonism, and must beg you, as a personal favor, to publish this letter immediately, should you find my name mentioned again by these wretched fanatics. Yours respectfully, Charles Anthon. I'm sorry, I just love that letter. It's just so straightforward, but I gotta be honest, from the research that I have been doing, this letter is often quote mined for intellectually nefarious reasons. I think it's important to read it in its entirety and examine it in comparison to Not-So-Smarty-Marty side of the story. I will be posting in the show notes a link of a picture to the Caractors manuscript that Marty reportedly took with him for the meeting. We'll talk about it in a minute when we examine Charlie's letter, but it's if you have the time to take a look at it, it's pretty interesting to see it. First, let's talk about Marty's side of the meeting. He did make some fairly extraordinary claims. Let's start with, quote, Professor Anthon stated that the translation was correct, more so than any he had before seen translated from the Egyptian, unquote. Getting into the lingual anachronisms of the Book of Mormon will probably be an episode of itself. So for now, let's just go with the claim that the church currently posits and say it was Reformed Egyptian that Joe was translating from. So let me give you some background on the scholarly comprehension of ancient Egyptian. We had none until 1822, when Jean-Francois Champollion published his early work on the Rosetta Stone translation. Hundreds of scholars had been working to compile a functioning model of the Egyptian language since the Rosetta Stone discovery in 1799. Along with some major correspondence and the customary diverging stories of exactly who deserves the final credit, Champollion published a fairly comprehensive Egyptian dictionary in late 1822. This dictionary took until 1858 to arrive on the East Coast in an English translation. It wasn't even translated into Latin, which Charlie was well versed in, until the early 1840s. So there is no possible way that Charlie would have any idea what he was looking at when he and Marty met in 1828. He wouldn't have even had any scholarly material to reference to see what it was. I would argue that there weren't even that many people alive in the world that could have looked at that manuscript that Marty had and be able to confirm that it was indeed an accurate translation. The knowledge simply didn't exist at the time. But let's go on and examine Marty's next extraordinary claim. Quote, I then showed him those which were not yet translated, and he said that they were Egyptian, Chaldaic, Assyriac, and Arabic, and he said they were true characters. End quote. Once again, I just have to harken back to the simple fact that nobody on the East Coast would have been able to make this claim at this time. Possibly nobody in the world would have known all of those languages all compiled together. And it's a great question, why were all of those languages in this one single piece of paper that Joseph scratched from these golden plates? I mean, you're talking Egyptian, and it's now just been devolved down to Reformed Egyptian because nobody knows what that actually is. Chaldaic, Assyriac, not Syrian, Assyriac, and Arabic. I mean, it's just what Arabic? Ancient Arabic, current Arabic? I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. Nobody could have been able to do this at the time. And I really have to imagine that Charlie was probably an intellectually honest guy. I mean, at the time, he was trying to gain notoriety for his scholarly work, and I can't imagine that he would put his career and professional name on the line for some people he described as rogues, just to, fuck with this simple-hearted farmer? That just doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry. Let's look at Marty's next big claim. This is a bit longer, but there's a lot of information to unpack. Quote, he gave me a certificate, certifying to the people of Palmyra that they were true characters, and that the translation of such of them as had been translated was also correct. I took the certificate and put it in my pocket, and was just leaving the house, when Mr. Anthon called me back, and asked me how the young man found out that there were gold plates in the place where he found them. I answered that an angel of God had revealed it to him. He then said to me, let me see that certificate. I accordingly took it out of my pocket and gave it to him, when he took it and tore it to pieces, saying that there was no such thing as ministering of angels, and that if I would bring the plates to him, he would translate them. So, there are some problems with this claim. I can't imagine that Charlie wasn't a religious man at the time. I mean, he was well versed in Greek and Latin, which are two common major studies for Bible scholars at the time and even today. And a Bible scholar would be the right person to bring this manuscript to, so kudos to Not-So-Smarty-Marty for that. But I would think that if Charlie recognized the translations were indeed accurate, and following that, the person who brought him this manuscript told him they came from an uneducated young man who was shown their location by an angel of God, this would mark the merriment of Charlie's life, work, and faith, and would likely spur some very serious action on Charlie's part. Any scholar would want to at least find out the facts behind such an extraordinary occurrence, and he could have his somewhat early career launched into scholarly fame by being the first scholar that ever vetted Mormonism, right? But he thought it was a hoax. According to his account, he didn't even want to give Marty a letter saying that it was false, probably because he didn't want to mar his burgeoning career, but declined on the basis that it seemed like a scheme to cheat the farmer out of his money. I do, however, have to mention a letter written in 1841 by Charlie to Reverend Coit of New Rochelle, New York, that directly contradicts just a small claim in here. It says, quote, he, meaning Martin Harris, then proceeded to give me the history of the whole affair, which convinced me that he had fallen into the hands of some sharper, while it left me in great astonishment at his simplicity. On my telling the bearer of the paper that an attempt had been made to impose on him and defraud him of his property, he requested me to give him my opinion in writing about the paper which he had shown me. I did so without hesitation. partly for the man's sake and partly to let the individual behind the curtain see that his trick was discovered. So this is an interesting little piece of contradiction, but I'm not really sure what to make of it. While it doesn't necessarily modify the meat and potatoes of Charlie's claims, it is something that I want to address. The letter is written 7 years after the first letter, making it 13 years after the incident itself. I highly doubt that Charlie had the foresight to see Mormonism gaining the terrible reputation that it did 13 years after such a simple-hearted, wealthy farmer came to speak with him for possibly an hour about some scratchings on a piece of paper. I doubt that Charlie even gave the meeting much of a thought at the time, or even a second thought. However, I would be willing to bet that the church dubiously used Charlie's name to claim authenticity based off of Not-So-Smarty-Marty's recounting of the story. Marty's account not only serves to villainize Charlie and intellects as a whole, but it also claims that he told Marty that Joe knew what the fuck he was doing, which is a claim I cannot see coming from Charles Anthon. The church must have been using this all along because they still use it today. I pulled Martin Harris's account from the LDS.org website, and it was from the Joseph Smith history. To anybody that's unaware of what the Joseph Smith history is, it's another small book that's contained in the Pearl of Great Price, which is Mormon Holy Canon, written by the hand of Joseph himself. We'll probably refer to it a lot in the future because it's so fascinating and offers a lot of insights that Mormons don't always know about today. So you can see the urgency in Charlie's letters to divorce him from the Mormon Church. It was shitting all over his name because every Mormon missionary would claim that Charlie verified the accuracy of the plates, and the people they preached to didn't have the knowledge or the resources to find and verify this claim. If the investigator asked the missionary if they could see a copy of the certificate of authenticity from Charlie, the missionaries would simply say, well, Marty told Charlie that Joe found the plates by revelation from an angel. Charlie ripped the paper up, so we don't really have proof of it. But we swear he said it's true! The people that were lying for the Lord at the foundations of the church could never understand how readily available all this information would be for us today. Unfortunately, the church has grown exponentially for about 185 years since then, and that's kind of a lot of foundation to chip away. So, let's jump on Charlie's final claim to finish out the episode today. It's a little longer, but there's a lot to unpack as well. So, quote, he brought with him the golden book in print and offered it to me for sale. I declined purchasing. He then asked permission to leave the book with me for examination. I declined receiving it, although his manner was strangely urgent. I adverted once more to the roguery which had been, my opinion, practiced upon him, and asked him what had become of the gold plates. He informed me that they were in a trunk with the large pair of spectacles. I advised him to go to a magistrate and have the trunk examined. He said the curse of God would come upon him should he do this. On my pressing him, however, to pursue the course which I had recommended, he told me that he would open the trunk if I would take the curse of God upon myself. I replied that I would do so with the greatest willingness, and would incur every risk of that nature, provided I could only extricate him from the grasp of rogues. He then left me. There is truly no Mormon reference to this secondary meeting. I could not find a single apologist that talks about it. No Mormon website refers to it, much less tries to refute it. It's just simply overlooked. However, I do find this to be quite hilarious. It illustrates how hard up for money Marty was, as well as the kind of person Charlie was. Charlie told Marty outright that Joe was full of meerkat shit, and Marty tried to sell the plates to Charlie. Charlie probably laughed at him and said, I'll be happy to take on the curse of God, not to purchase them, but to prove myself right and show you how bad you were hoodwinked. And Marty fucking storms off. It's great. We do have to weigh the content of these claims individually and upon the merits of the individuals who made the claims. On one hand, you have Not-So-Smarty-Marty super study party pooper pal Charlie Anthon, who was a burgeoning scholar making no positive claims of authenticity, but rather he tells Marty on 2 occasions that he's being DEFCON 5 level swindled here, and Marty storms off in a fit of rage both times. Then we have Not-So-Smarty-Marty himself, the simple farmer with an assload of money that has made a significant financial investment. He tries to verify the accuracy of the plates and fails, which follows by him saying to him, "If you leave me alone, I'll make money of it," to his wife. Remember when we talked about that in the last episode? So she leaves his broke ass, and he's left to make money the only way he can after losing everything to Joseph Smith's selfish so-called revelations by trying to sell the plates to the person that told him he's already fucked. Marty had a financial stake in the accuracy of the Book of Mormon and was well known for lying about things only relating to Mormonism. He was an honest guy otherwise. Whereas Charlie had nothing to gain from the meeting and probably went home that night and laughed about it, thinking it would never become what it did. Charlie went on to retire from the headmaster position of the Columbia Language and Grammar School in 1864. Marty went on to do all kinds of crazy shit in the church that we can't really get into now, but for the most part that sums up Martin Harris's early role in the foundations of the church. We will keep a tab on Marty and refer to him from time to time, but that's about all we need to know concerning Not-So-Smarty-Marty for now. I hope this episode was just as enjoyable as the previous episode, and thank you for joining me this week. And be sure to check out next week when we examine Oliver Cowdery in depth here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. Any material or intellectual property used in this podcast is that of the owner of the copyright and is used in accordance with the Fair Use Act for educational and commentary purposes only. This podcast is made under Creative Commons for the purpose of open distribution and education. Any citations needed that are not mentioned are available in the show notes. Hello there. Thanks for sticking around. So, a little bonus for this episode. I'm going to try my best to decipher the Caractors transcript. I left a link to it in the show notes, but it's pretty interesting. I'm going to bring this all into a point in a second here. So I'm just going to read a few of them. There's an H with two, the vertical lines are curved like a D. The next character is an H with the tops and bottoms of each vertical line, or have little squigglies on them. The next one's a 4 with an extra top. Next is an equal sign with a squiggle at the beginning. Next looks like when you're tallying up 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you do a 5 slash diagonally through. Well, it looks like that with a slash straight through and then a little smiley face thing on the bottom. 2 L's, 4 with a little squiggly on top, a 6 with a dash, a T with a curved bottom, an A, lowercase t, just a single line, and then 2 slightly curved lines, a C, 8, 1, that looks like either an H or an A with a really cool looking squiggly on top, a T with a squiggle, a U, number 2 in the top kind of looks a little modified, a 3 turned on its side with a dot in the middle, and then just a normal 3 next to that. Let's see, a backward 7, a forward 7, an A without the middle line, a D with a bigger left vertical bar, a V with a dot in the middle, a T, a Y with slightly more squiggly lines, another Y next to that with a longer bottom, a big L, then 006. There is literally a 006 in here, so he knew about the agent before James Bond. So, that's something to take into account. Why do I talk why is this all important? Have you seen a picture of Egyptian hieroglyphs? How amazing they are! They're pictorial. They're like it's really hard to explain, but I strongly recommend looking at them. There's just amazing pictures of what they're exactly illustrating. It's a phonetic language. That's what I'm trying to say. It's each character is mapped to a picture of something that makes a certain phonetic sound, and it looks nothing like the Caractors letter that Joseph produced. It is nothing like it. Now it's so clear why Charles Anthon was just his descriptions were like tarot. There's Roman numerals, there's all kinds of recognizable languages, but it didn't betray the source from whence they came. I mean, Joseph was a great synthesizer of information, and this was no exception. I'm quite impressed. So, thanks for sticking around. I'm going to include these little extra snippets at the end of some episodes. It won't always be on Joseph. It won't always be on the church. It'll just be probably random thoughts, but it'll be every couple episodes. So I hope you enjoy. Thanks for sticking around.